Okay, so you've watched Finding Forrester, and you've internalized the message that anyone can write, and taken on the lessons it had to share with you about getting into a writing rhythm. But that doesn't change the fact that in order to get started on your next big project, you still need one more thing.
I have beautiful, pristine yellow tablets, ready to go. Nice fresh blocks of pencils. I'm all set. All I need is an idea.
And if you've watched authors do interviews or convention appearances, you'll find that the same question gets asked a lot. Where do you get your ideas? And you'll also notice that it becomes like a running joke that writers don't like answering this question. Now, it's extremely common for writers to explain how they got an idea. Lin-Manuel Miranda got the idea for Hamilton, the musical, while reading Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, while Lin was on vacation. Joss Whedon got the idea for Firefly after reading The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, and was inspired to write Buffy the Vampire Slayer as a response to problematic tropes in horror films. Neil Gaiman has discussed having the idea for American Gods while on vacation in Norway. George Lucas created Star Wars because he couldn't afford the film rights to Flash Gordon, so they made up their own franchise. But I've also seen a lot of creatives, including Neil Gaiman and Patrick Rothfuss, essentially dodge the larger question of where writers actually get their ideas. And that's a shame because I actually think it's extremely important to demystify this part of writing. Because the more we treat ideas as sacred, the more of a disservice we do to the actual act of writing. Because I would argue that, where do you get your ideas? Is entirely the wrong question. Before we begin, just a heads up, I'm going to reference and quote Neil Gaiman kind of a lot in this video. He's been one of my favorite authors for a long time, and the entire premise for this video arose from hearing him discuss this subject in interviews and at convention appearances. And now it's a bit awkward because he's gotten into some hot water regarding some claims about his personal relationships. If these claims are true, then they would indicate some pretty profound abuses of power and flagrant disrespect for the boundaries of others. Now, this video isn't about those stories. There are some excellent videos linked in the description that go into that subject in more detail. I do strongly recommend you check them out and see exactly what he's been accused of and why I'm inclined to believe these claims despite the flaws with the forum that first brought them to light. But I bring this up to make sure you know that the references I make to Neil Gaiman throughout this video are not in any way meant to condone the behavior he's been accused of. Also, like I said, while I am going to quote Neil Gaiman a lot throughout this video, if it helps, at the end of this video, my ultimate point is that he's wrong about something, just in case that makes you feel better. I don't know. So let's start with the quote that kicked off the idea for this video. I'm not going to play the whole clip because these quotes came from cell phone footage of Neil Gaiman from convention appearances, so the sound is awful. So I'll just read you the quote. If anybody ever talks to a writer, at some point you will say, "Where do you get your ideas?" And the writer will make fun of you. We will mock you. I've heard writers come up with all sorts of evil, fun things. From the idea of the month club, from a little ideas shop in Poughkeepsie, you phone an 800 number and they call you once a week with an idea. And the reason writers are terrible at answering, "Where do you get your ideas?" is because we don't know. And it scares us. Now, like I said earlier, plenty of writers have discussed where they got the ideas for specific projects. For example, let's take a look at George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series. The concept for the series itself is inspired by the War of the Roses, to the point where he originally considered just writing historical fiction about that real war, but he didn't want the audience to know what was going to happen before it happened, which is often the case with historical fiction. And considering his Game of Thrones books are famous for being unpredictable, I'd say he made the right call there. But he also had a bunch of other influences. The wall that borders the north was inspired by a visit to Hadrian's Wall. Spoilers for the first book and the end of the first season of Game of Thrones, but the death of Ned Stark is inspired by the death of Janet Leigh's character in Psycho. And in fact, a lot of his attitudes towards fantasy as a genre were inspired by the issues he had with The Lord of the Rings. Sure, he seems to love those books and he definitely respects Tolkien as a writer, but he's also argued multiple times that Gandalf should have stayed dead, which is why the major deaths, like Ned Stark, don't tend to get reversed in his books. And in a Rolling Stone interview, he laid out some examples of how Lord of the Rings reflects a different worldview from his own, and how that manifests in a very different approach to storytelling. Ruling is hard. This was maybe my answer to Tolkien, whom, as much as I admire him, I do quibble with. Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy, that if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at real history and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became a king and reigned for 100 years and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all those orcs? By the end of the war, Sauron is gone, but all the orcs aren't gone. They're in the mountains. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide and kill them? Even the little baby orcs in their little orc cradles? In real life kings had real-life problems to deal with. Just being a good guy was not the answer. You had to make hard decisions. Sometimes what seemed to be a good decision turned around and bit you in the ass. It was the law of unintended consequences. I've tried to get at some of these in my books. My people who are trying to rule don't have an easy time of it. Just having good intentions doesn't make you a wise king. Now, Martin doesn't draw a direct line here to any one thing in his books that was inspired by these concepts, but it seems like these questions about Aragorn serve as the inspiration for not just the themes of his books, but arguably even some of the characters like Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon. Ned Stark is a good man, But as Martin points out, just being a good man who wants to do good doesn't mean you're going to be an effective ruler, especially in Martin's world, as Ned Stark learns rather tragically. But also, I think there's a connection to Robert Baratheon here. Robert isn't a good man, he maybe never was, but he was a great warrior. Like Aragorn, he fought the good fight, and he was good at leading men in battle. He was also a great general. But this also doesn't make him a good ruler, because he's not. He's a terrible king. And Martin wanted to explore that dichotomy in his books because, at least in part, he felt that it was absent from Tolkien's work. And in that same Rolling Stone interview, Martin was asked where his imagination came from. And just like Gaiman, he said he didn't know. But I don't know where it comes from, yet it comes. It's always come. If I was a religious guy, I'd say it's a gift from God. But I'm not, so I can't say that. Stephen King has also discussed the origin of a lot of his ideas. For example, both The Stand and the Dark Tower series were heavily inspired by The Lord of the Rings. The Dark Tower was also directly inspired by the poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning, and heavily inspired by The Legend of King Arthur and by Clint Eastwood's Dollars trilogy. Meanwhile, The Stand is about a plague that signals the beginning of the end times, and in addition to The Lord of the Rings, this book was inspired by a 60-minute piece on chemical biological warfare, and by the song Don't Fear the Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult.
I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
And of course, Stephen King's iconic villain, Randall Flagg, first appeared in a short story before he appeared in The Stand, and then made a lot of other appearances in other Stephen King books, including in The Dark Tower. And Flagg was inspired in part by Donald DeFreeze, the lead kidnapper of Patty Hearst, and specifically how early photographs and eyewitnesses could barely get a glimpse of him. So I don't think it's at all uncommon for writers to discuss where they got individual ideas. But if we are to believe Neil Gaiman's anecdotes about how writers answer this question, it seems like writers are just really bad at figuring out the larger pattern for where they got their ideas in general. As Martin said, I don't know where it comes from. However, sometimes writers do actually sit down and try to answer where ideas in general come from. On his website, Stephen King has an FAQ section, and one of the questions is, of course, where do you get your ideas? And this is how he answers. I get my ideas from everywhere. But what all of my ideas boil down to is seeing maybe one thing, but in a lot of cases it's seeing two things and having them come together in some new and interesting way, and then asking the question, what if? What if is always the key question. And Neil Gaiman has told the story of a time that he had to answer this question seriously. He was asked the question by a friend of his daughter, and so he couldn't give this little girl his usual snarky answer. I would also argue that aspiring writers shouldn't get snarky answers either, but that's neither here nor there. So he gave an answer very similar to Stephen King's. However, his answer also contains a pretty profound problem. Despite being mostly a great answer, I think it still contains the big fallacy I want to debunk. So for context, here's the full quote. You get ideas from a bunch of different places, normally from asking yourself questions. You can ask yourself a question like, what if? What if I could fly? What if I could turn invisible? If only. If only I was as small as a mouse. You can ask yourself questions like, if this goes on, what would happen? If we all keep using our phones in the way we currently use our phones, after a while we would lose the ability to talk to each other face to face, unless we were taking photographs of ourselves with the person that we're talking to. But I said primarily what you do is you daydream. Everybody daydreams. Everybody lets their mind wander. You look out of the window and you start just not paying attention to the world and following a particular sort of train of thought, which kind of makes sense to you. And then, if you're a writer, you notice you're following it and you start taking it seriously. And you start asking yourself questions that build up on it logically. And suddenly, you have a story. I love how Neil boils ideas down to simple questions, but doesn't limit it to just one question like what if. It helps demonstrate that ideas can come in different forms, and I think that's valuable. I love that he points out that everybody daydreams and lets their minds wander. And I especially love that he points out that writers have simply trained themselves to follow these ideas to their logical conclusions, and that's how they get their stories. But when he says, suddenly you have a story, the word suddenly is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, isn't it? Because stories don't suddenly happen. And this is why I think writers put way too much emphasis on the idea of ideas. We constantly talk about ideas as if the ideas themselves are somehow precious. But some writers do understand that this overemphasis on ideas misses the point. And one of those writers is George R.R. Martin. Because I lied to you before. The quote I read was only part of Martin's answer about where he gets his ideas. Here's the full quote. Ideas are cheap. I have more ideas now than I could ever write up. To my mind, it's the execution that is all important. I'm proud of my work, but I don't know if I'd ever claim it's enormously original. You look at Shakespeare, who borrowed all of his plots. In A Song of Ice and Fire, I take stuff from The War of the Roses and other fantasy things, and all these things work around in my head, and somehow they gel into what I hope is uniquely my own. But I don't know where it comes from, yet it comes. It's always come. If I was a religious guy, I'd say it's a gift from God, but I'm not, so I can't say that. See, Martin gets it. The ideas are not the important part. Ideas are not some sacred, precious, prized jewels that we need to elevate and put on pedestals. Everybody has ideas. The difference between writers and normal people is that normal people don't realize they're having ideas for stories. Writers have trained themselves to recognize the potential in these musings so many people have every day. And then, and this is the actually important part, writers do the work and write things down.
I ever tell you about my Star Trek script?
Star Trek script?
Yeah, I gotta write it down is all.
Everybody, even the lowliest of stoners, has ideas. Anybody can walk out of a movie and go, well, that stunk. I wish they'd done this other thing instead. I know so many people who say things like, I keep seeing movies and TV shows about X topic, whatever it is, but they never do why. They never talk about that. And I wish they would because I think that would be interesting. But writers just go write that version. That's it. That's the difference. They don't just muse on an idea, they explore it and write about it. That's the only difference. I had a friend who would ask musings about fantasy monsters, like, if you drink holy water, would your pee burn a vampire? Now, I have my own answer to that question based on my feelings on, like, religion and faith and stuff, but also if you told me vampires were weak to asparagus instead of holy water, then asked me the same question, yeah, that might change my answer. I might be much more inclined to say that you could get holy pee that would burn a vampire. But the difference between me and my friend is that when I hear that question, I might start to wonder, why would you bother? Like, sure, that's kind of an interesting question, I guess, but how would it even happen? In what circumstance would you ever need to drink holy water rather than just keeping it bottled and splashing it on a vampire, which I think would be much faster? Well, what if you had holy water with you when you went through airport security, and the TSA agent tells you that you can't bring a full bottle of liquid, but you can't just pour it out, you're on the trail of a vampire, you need this holy water. So you have to find some way to get rid of it without getting rid of it. So you drink it. And once you're on the plane, maybe you go to the bathroom and pee into a bottle, and now you've got your holy water pee. And now there's actually a dramatic question here. Is the holy water still going to work? When you get into the situation where you're face to face with a vampire, are you willing to risk everything on the chance that your urine still carries enough divine mojo to burn the flesh of the undead? What happens if you're wrong? How desperate would you have to be that you would even still try? And now, you have a story. Suddenly, I guess you have a story, thanks Neil. But that is what writers do. They don't come up with ideas, that's what everyone does, just by letting their mind wander. Writers do the hard part of actually converting those ideas into scenarios that contain drama, that have tension. You want a simple answer for where writers get their ideas? Writers don't just ask, what if or if only. Everybody does that. Writers ask follow-up questions. That's a secret that nobody wants to admit. Writers are only special because we stick with an idea and we try to follow it to its logical conclusion. And then, and this is pretty important, they sit down and they write it. Do you think Stephen King's premises are the most important part of his writing? Because they're not. I don't want to undersell how good he is at coming up with ideas. He's got some great high-concept stories. But that's not what makes him so good. Like, I love 11/22/63. But let's be honest, would you try to stop the Kennedy assassination if you could travel through time? It's not exactly an idea that nobody but Stephen King had ever had before, you know what I mean? No, when we talk about how impressive Stephen King is as a writer, you already know what truly sets him apart from his peers.
How the fuck do you write so many books so fast?
And King answers. I just sit down and I write for 3 or 4 hours a day, and I focus on getting 6 pages written every single day. That's it. That's how he writes so fast. Not because he's got the best ideas ever, no offense to Stephen King, because the quality of the ideas is not the point at all. The point is that King is serious about the craft. Ideas aren't precious. When we ask, where do you get your ideas, we're missing the point. Ideas come from everywhere. Ideas aren't special. Ideas aren't what makes you a writer. What makes you a writer is looking at an idea and asking yourself, okay, so what happens next?